Well, I want to move to what is maybe the most apocalyptic issue of our time. That's climate change. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by Max Eil, who is the author of A People's Green New Deal, which, by the way, you can find at 1804 Books at the People's Forum in New York City, where I'm based, if you want to check that out. Fantastic book. Also, of course, Max was interviewed by Rania Khalek on Rania Khalek Dispatches about just this topic. Max, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, we saw the new UN report, the IPCC report on the climate. Obviously, bad news, I guess you could say. I don't know if it was that shocking. Definitely not good news, but very bad. I mean, I'm just curious, Max, just at the outset, seeing reports like this, especially sort of in the way that it was sort of framing it, that, you know, many bad things are already locked in. I think a lot of people feeling very pessimistic about what's possible when they see reports like this. I mean, you know, where does this leave us in terms of how people should view the changing climate? Is it now just a fait accompli, or are there still things people can do to mitigate the damage?
Chances are, overwhelmingly chances are that there is an awful lot that we can do, and that we can head off most of the worst of the consequences for the global north and the global south alike. So if we look through the series of projections for different temperature increases, we see that it is indeed possible. There are trajectories of emissions and changes and reductions in emissions, which will keep overall global warming more or less below 1.5 degrees with a very brief overshoot. And there are trajectories that will keep us below 2 degrees. So the question is not that whether or not there's anything to do. The question is whether or not we're going to be able to form political mobilizations that are capable of doing it. So the despair is counterproductive on multiple levels. I mean, first of all, it's counterproductive above all because the difference between, say, 2 degrees and 4 degrees is the difference between catastrophe and survivability for most of the planet. So this is a huge difference that we have to keep in mind, right? And so accepting despair is totally not helpful in terms of mobilizing people, because people aren't going to be mobilized upon despair that you can't change the world to make it better. People need to be mobilized around the fact that you can change the world for the better, and it happens to be the truth, right? So this is the important thing to focus on, right? In terms of, there's also nothing new in the report, right? This is the most important thing to keep in mind, is that the report is basically saying that what we thought were probabilities are now near certainties in terms of the likelihood of what they call the human impact on the Earth system and climate change. Now, this is just because scientists are inherently conservative, and they don't like to say very likely unless their models tell them that it's very likely. But everybody knows what's actually happening. This is not really heavily in dispute at this point. The question is what to do about it.
I'm curious.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to, I think it's really important that you noted, you know, that we can't get depressed and nihilistic about this. Cause like you said, there is a huge difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees. That said, you know, what's interesting about a report like this is, of course, it made like the sort of elite media, the bourgeoisie media was like really shocked by it. A lot of elites were shocked by it. You had a lot of world leaders come out and say, you know, like Joe Biden himself came out and said, this is serious. We got to do something about climate change. And that's all great. But, you know, a few days later, it's reported that the Biden administration has called on OPEC, the oil cartel, and its allies to pump even more oil. And this was just days after this UN report was released. So it speaks to this lack of political will. And I think it goes to the issue at the heart of climate change, which is what's driving it. And that is capitalism, right? And so I guess like, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this disconnect of finally, okay, liberal elites are accepting, yes, the climate change is a problem. It's an issue. We have to deal with it. You know, they've got all these things they say they're going to do about it, but they don't. But at the same time, like, how do we deal with that when no one's actually talking about the heart of this issue?
I think a lot of people are talking about the heart of the issue. I think a lot of people are now discussing capitalism as a major cause of the problem. Of course, the IPCC is not. It says it blames an undifferentiated humanity. Whereas, as we know very well, the problem is capitalism. And the problem is not only capitalism, but it's also imperialism. So, in fact, I think
Right.
many people are, in fact, beginning to discuss what is going on. The problem is that, one, their diagnosis is partial, and two, uh, there's not an organization around the correct diagnosis, not sufficient organization around the correct diagnosis. So, first, to fix the poor diagnosis, the problem is not just capitalism, right? The problem is capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. This is not just throwing out some buzzwords, right? This reminds us that the North, meaning the European countries, their settler offshoots, and Japan, are overwhelmingly responsible for the historical bulk of emissions, with a very small responsibility in terms of overshoot now coming from an industrialized China. Although a lot of the consumption related to that production is actually offshored from the United States. Now, what this tells us is that you actually need a change of gears fundamentally in the political, social, economic systems in the United States. There should not just be broadly anti-capitalist, right? Because it's kind of it's quite in style to be critiquing capitalism, right? It actually
Good
also
point.
needs to be anti-imperialist. It has to pay reparations to the South so that the South can also survive, and so the South can also have a just transition to deal with the climate crisis. Right? This is what is so fundamental, and so I think this is the most important thing. And I think the other aspect of the problem is that we don't. The political vehicles to deal with it are, in the core, at least in the wealthier states, are severely inadequate. Right? You see burbles at the edges of of DSA, or at the grassroots of Extinction Rebellion, at the grassroots maybe of the Sunrise Movement, but the agenda is largely oriented is hewing way too closely to the Democratic Party, and is incapable of putting forward a transformative agenda, let alone a transformative agenda that's working in concert with the peoples of the South, right? As opposed to running roughshod against them and often demonizing them, right? You see very prominent climate intellectuals who are demonizing Venezuela and Bolivia, or supporting coup d'etat against them, right? How on earth can you actually carry out a just transition when the countries with the governments, or that which are at least the crucibles, or the fortresses behind which you have some of the more radical movements, are actively being demonized by the so-called organic intelligentsia of the climate movement? I mean, it's a disaster for political mobilization.
No, I think that's a very good point, and I mean, it seems like, on so many levels, there's a lot there. I mean, but it feels like, the new Cold War against China, I mean, feels like it could almost be called a war against the planet. I mean, the idea that China should be the biggest enemy and must be destroyed at all cost, as opposed to having and already playing, quite frankly, a very significant role in the fight against climate change, and in many ways, you could say maybe the most significant role of any large country, at least. It just seems like it's almost understated, the impact of it, when you say new Cold War, because the implications of it, I mean, on many levels, of course, but certainly on the climate level, are so huge and such a threat to humanity.
China is a huge scapegoat for Western liberals, Western conservatives, and large chunks of the Western left. China is a tremendous scapegoat. And this is, in effect, shrugging at any sort of serious assumption of the burden of transformation in the North. I mean, the emissions from Europe and the United States are out of control. Both Europe and the United States are built on legacies of massive colonial looting. Europe and the United States owe something close to $3 trillion of climate debt to the South each year, in order to allow the South to also have a just transition. Europe and the United States, never mind, also have a legacy of colonialism and settler genocide. And people want us to be worrying about China. And you can't open the New York Times without the latest fear piece, fear mongering about China, or you have this kind of stirred up, encanted demon, which is the concern about China's environmental record. Of course, China also needs to get to zero emissions. There's no question. And if we take climate debt seriously, China is currently owing some climate debt to the remainder of the South. We can agree on that. But what we can't agree upon, if people who want to change the situation in a progressive, anti-systemic and liberatory way, is that it's really very beneficial at all to be discussing China. I mean, China is also carrying out a much faster pace of building renewable energy than Europe and the United States. So I think it's just been, it's counterproductive to, and is probably a deliberate agent, confusing agent that's designed to sow confusion and disorientation about people's orientation and ability to mobilize around the central issues in the United States, which are an immediate renewables transition, right, within a decade, hard and declining caps on fossil fuel use. You can read also Stan Cox's book on the Green New Deal, which really lays that out very well. Climate debt payments to the South, full conversion of the agricultural system to agroecology, which allows carbon drawdown, massive agrarian reforms, and decommodification of all the necessary social infrastructure for human beings to live decent lives. I mean, that's what we need, right? In addition to other things, which, there's quite a laundry list. I can expand on it a little bit. But those are some fundamental things. What does China have to do with the fact that we need an agrarian reform, agroecology, and climate debt in the United States? It has nothing at all to do with it.
Well, and I think it also goes to the issue of what is the world's biggest polluter, and that is the U.S. military, which doesn't ever get talked about. I don't think that report mentioned it. I doubt it. I didn't read the entire report, but I highly doubt that they mentioned that the biggest polluter in the world is the U.S. military. But, Max, I'm curious. I saw, like, in my YouTube feed, something popped up today, and I wanted to bring this up with you because you and I have talked about this again. And I interviewed you and we had a longer discussion about this, and I encourage people to go check that out on our YouTube page. But for those who are watching right now, this video popped up about, I think it was like Elon Musk, warning about population explosion and implosion as a result. And you see this more and more in the mainstream, especially among these sort of like liberal elites, the billionaire class who are funding this ideology as well. This idea that as climate change gets worse, the real culprit, you mentioned that the UN report blamed humanity in like a very, unspecific way. And the real culprit becomes humanity. Something's wrong with human beings because there's too many of us. How do you respond to that claim that I really do see more and more popping up? Is the problem is there's going to be shortages because there's just too many human beings and people are having too many kids, especially poor people, right? We got to do something about that. What's your response to that?
I think these are warrants for genocide, actually. I mean, I think we need to not mince words about it, that is what they are. I mean, these arguments go back several hundred years to Malthus and this whole idea of Malthusian thought that basically the poor were unable to control their breeding, and therefore we should, at that time, England should dismantle its social protection for poor people. Right, that was justification, and Malthus claimed that population was increasing exponentially, whereas food production was increasing only arithmetically, and there was a fixed amount of land. Productivity was increasing only very slowly, et cetera, et cetera. This was total nonsense, right? I mean, there's plenty of food available on the planet now to not only feed everybody on the planet, but to feed the whole planet several times over, right? In fact, no one even knows how much food is produced. These numbers are purely invented for the most part. They're not counted adequately. Now, it's the same thing now, right? Whenever you hear this question of overpopulation, whenever you hear this problem of high birth rates, whenever you hear this problem of Malthusianism, whenever you hear this question of demography, outside of, unless you have like a very radical progressive government that's carrying out a program of participatory birth, birth control that empowers women, outside of this very narrow context, you need to keep your ears open, because this is kind of the watchword of fascism, right? The basic argument is that somehow you have this this abstract entity, humanity, that's taking too many resources, and we just know that that's wrong, right? We know immediately that this is wrong on multiple levels. First of all, we know it's wrong because the resource use is very uneven, right? It's highly concentrated on a north-south basis. It's highly concentrated again within the North on wealth basis, on who has higher incomes, who has higher percentages of the fixed assets and investments, and above all, it's finally, we know that it's wrong because production of waste is actually related to private control over the means of production, right? In other words, capitalism, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about private monopoly, imperialist control over the means of production. This is what produces waste, right? This is what the capacity to externalize, as it's called, the costs, for example, of carbon dioxide, primarily onto the south, onto Mozambique, onto Bangladesh, onto China, India, Zimbabwe, right? Haiti, Puerto Rico, the capacity to do that is related to class power as a legacy of colonialism and as a consequence of ongoing neocolonialism and imperialism, right? So now those societies, of course, people in the South in general, are not really using all that much resources in the first place. In the second place, everyone on Earth has more or less the right to an equal share of the world's resources used in a permanently sustainable manner. If you put it like that, someone might argue against it. I don't know who, and I don't know who can argue against it. But and that's why you hear this rhetoric of Malthusianism and of overpopulation, because in fact, it's almost an implicit acknowledgement. It's an acknowledgement that you have to get rid of these people because they're demanding an equal share of the world's resources. So therefore, you have to get rid of them. Therefore, they're overbreeding precisely because they do have such a claim, right? And this is why, for example, the Gates Foundation, which is, of course, heavily involved in engineering responses to climate change, so-called, needless to say, lab meat, et cetera, and a lot of the geoengineering schemes, is also involved in very aggressive forms of birth control in Africa, which is supposedly ground zero for this population explosion that will supposedly be unmanageable. And we know that this is just these aren't serious arguments, because people who have done serious projections and work through the numbers basically show that you can give everybody on Earth a decent life with relatively, basically within the Earth's envelope for sustainability, using existing technology. Never mind the kinds of technology that could be innovated if the forms of scientific research were not subject to the laws of profit, right? So this is really something that we need to be very much aware of, and we also need to be able to push back on it and state clearly that the problem is not humans' capacity to find a decent place for themselves within the Earth system, right? That's very possible. It's possible for 7 billion, it's possible for 9 million, it's possible for 10 or 11 billion. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of energy, there's plenty of housing, and there's plenty of land. There aren't enough of those things when they're shared with in a savagely unequal manner.
In a phrase, Max, it really feels that, well, maybe it was true when she said it the first time, but Rosa Luxemburg's phrase, socialism or barbarism, that really is a choice in front of humanity at this moment.
I'm with that, just keeping in mind that barbarism has been the constant, right?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But it will get certainly will get more barbaric, and I've discussed this with Rania before, that the plan is global Gaza, right? For that to be a laboratory for kind of reducing populations to a very bare life with a very small use of resources, right? And this is very easily can become a laboratory. If you look at this is not just for populations in the periphery. This should also be kept in mind. If you look at a lot of what the new capitalism, right? It's renting the means of production from the ruling class. I mean, their business is built around renting people furniture. Their business is built around renting people bikes. And this is actually being touted in mainstream magazines as a kind of new low impact way of living. Well, it's kind of feudalism, right? I mean, you're basically paying for temporary access to the means of production, or to commodities and the things we need for life. So this is a way of sharply reducing the impact of human life, both in the North and South, on the environment. It's just not particularly just or humane.
Well, Max, oh no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just had one last question that's maybe a little less political. It could be political. I don't know. But if we're going to be talking about the climate, it would be wrong not to bring this up because, we see all over the world at this point, wildfires in Algeria, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Syria, Greece, California, Australia, Russia. It really does seem to be global. These wildfires, these forest fires. So I'm curious, from your perspective, is it global warming doing this, or is it agricultural practices, which is something that you study quite, in detail, or is it both? And why do they appear to be getting worse?
It's both. I'm not actually familiar with the ideologies of the forest fires in the Mediterranean. I'm actually more familiar with the practice of land management in the U.S., where there are these longstanding practices of clear cutting, right, and of removing, of allowing. Of suppressing fires, which allows the brush to build up, which means the fires get really hot when the fire gets out of control, and they just burn like crazy. And you also have people building homes in places that should never have homes, shouldn't necessarily have been zoned residential, right? And then that in turn encourages people to not allow these kind of itinerant wildfires to burn out. And you definitely can't do controlled burns when there's homes all over the place, right? Because burns are never exactly controlled. So there's a lot of land management issues, right? And of course, the indigenous people had for a very long time, used controlled burns in order to regulate the landscape, regulate the metabolic interaction of humans with the landscape in a very sustainable way. Now, so it's always a mix, right? It's a mix of poor landscape management, which actually also contributes to turning land from carbon absorbing to carbon emitting, and also increasing heat. Increasing heat, of course, makes everything drier, which makes things more susceptible to sudden fires, which means they can spread more rapidly than they were able to do historically. And it also means you tend to have less precipitation in the dry season, which in turn means that the natural forms of fire suppression don't exist, which means that, of course, the fires burn more and more intensely. So it's all it's all interwoven into this kind of hellish cycle, right? Where each negative impact on the environment or negative capitalist impact on the environment interacts synergistically with another negative human impact on the environment, in turn to make the whole landscape acutely vulnerable. So they're getting closer and closer to being able to say that specific extreme weather events are directly linked to global warming. In general, historically, they have talked probabilistically because they've been unable to say, okay, is this a direct result or not? But they're able to say more and more that that's the case. And so if I can add one more thing about that, though, it is notable that we're seeing them around the Mediterranean, right? And this is because one, the Mediterranean has always been slated to be a heavily impacted zone under global warming. And of course, the Mediterranean states of Europe are the poorest states, right? That's not a coincidence, right? Because these models they use model economic damage based on the value of fixed assets and so forth. And in fact, value human life to a lesser extent, generally in the global south, right? But it's also related to GDP per capita, it's related to income, et cetera. So by capitalism itself undervaluing the lives of people in the global south, it then becomes easier for capitalism to continue causing this immense damage to the ecology, which in turn makes southern ecologies less and less hospitable to human beings. So it itself has these horrible kind of accounting synergies, which are why, in part, global warming has remained unaddressed.
Well, Max Isle, really appreciate you joining us here on the show. Everyone here has to go check out A People's New Deal. Great book. Really appreciate all of your work and appreciate your time, giving us your time here on the Freedom Side.
Great. Thank you so much.